from Washington, D.C.
They got hit very hard recently, as you know. And I don't like to have to do things that way, but I felt it was necessary. They've all approved the deal. Everybody's approved the deal. Now we'll get it finished up, and hopefully that'll be done.
Tonight, total reversal. President Trump calls off planned military strikes against Iran, saying an agreement will be signed shortly. That optimism powering a rally on Wall Street, reversing a two-day slide in stocks. Plus, SpaceX makes IPO history. Elon Musk's SpaceX raises $75 billion in the biggest IPO on record. The pricing gives the company a valuation of roughly $1.8 trillion, but the next test when trading begins tomorrow. Plus, FISA deadline drama. President Trump taps former SEC Chair Jay Clayton as his next director of national intelligence, a move that could clear a key Democrat roadblock to extending a key surveillance law. But can Congress pass an extension in time? From Bloomberg's Washington, D.C. studios to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. I'm Kaylee Lyons. Joe Matthew has the night off. And we begin this evening with breaking news out of the White House. President Trump hailing a memorandum of understanding with Iran, calling parts of it, quote, a little bit conceptual, and saying that a final deal could be signed this weekend.
We just made a great settlement of the war with Iran, and we're going to be subject to finalization of documents, which should get done over the next few days. We'll probably have a signing maybe in Europe, and great thing. Stock market's up 1,000 points. That means they like the deal. See, that means they like. If the market goes down, that means they don't like the deal. But it's been up. Oil's dropped. Oil will start coming down to, I think, even lower than it was before. I said I was in Iowa. It was $1.85 a gallon. And I don't know if I'm going to get there, but we're going to get pretty close. It's going to come down, and when oil comes down, everything else comes down.
For more, we're joined by Bloomberg's Skylar Woodhouse live from the White House North Lawn. So, Skylar, what do we know about what exactly is in this conceptual deal?
Yeah, Kaylee, well, like you mentioned, this is a memorandum of understanding. So we'll have to wait and see what exactly that fine print includes. But the president moments ago and the Oval Office did mention that Karg Island will not be a part of this agreement. And he also said that he believes, so to his understanding, that Iran's supreme leader agreed to this deal. So we'll have to wait and see exactly what comes from this. The president said that Vice President J.D. Vance would be at the signing if that signing were to happen this weekend. The president has his UFC fight here at the White House, and you might be able to hear some of the sound check that's playing right now. But still lots of details that are looking to be understood right now, especially as we try and parse out how concrete this deal is after months of back and forth between the U.S. and Iran.
Well, and our understanding, Skylar, is if this deal is ultimately finalized by all sides, the U.S. naval blockade would end immediately?
Yes, Kaylee. So the president did mention, that's something we've been trying to consistently track, is this blockade, and if that means that it would stay in place or whether it would go away, and what that means for the Strait, especially as the president mentioned, he would like to see those oil prices come down. And to his understanding, once the war does end, then oil prices and fertilizer costs are all going to come down, which is something that he is keeping a close eye on.
All right, Bloomberg's Skylar Woodhouse from the White House North Lawn. Thank you so much. And certainly oil prices did come down today after the president's signal that a deal with Iran is near. It also sent stocks higher. So for the details, we turn now to power moves with Bloomberg's Romaine Bostick, who joins live from World Headquarters in New York. Romaine.
Yeah, and there was a direct correlation, Kaylee, at right around 1:30 p.m. Eastern time. The S&P 500 was actually in the red, believe it or not, and that was right around the time that we got a headline that Trump was calling off the planned strikes on Iran as more information came out about the potential for some sort of a deal. We then saw a huge rally on our hands. The S&P closed out the day up about 1.8%. The NASDAQ indices each rallying close to 3% on the day. Even the Russell 2000 also posting a gain of about 3%. Part of the reason, of course, is the next two lines you see there on the screen, a 9 basis point drop in benchmark Treasury yields and roughly about a 4 to 5% drop that we saw during the intraday session on Brent crude and WTI crude as well. WTI now below $90 a barrel. That actually gave airline stocks a big lift, which were up about 8% on the whole. And that was a huge sentiment shift because there was a lot of concerns going on out there about, of course, this market absorbing what is going to be the biggest IPO ever. I do want to turn your attention to some of the stocks that actually have managed to rally on the back of that because, of course, SpaceX is not a publicly traded company yet, but there are a lot of space companies that are. UFO, one of the main ETFs that tracks a lot of space companies that are companies that basically make rovers or they have certain types of infrastructure that could potentially be used on satellites, on rockets, or even on the moon, if you will. Those stocks as a whole got a big boost here, and it's more likely, based on what we're hearing from analysts and other Wall Street participants, Kaylee, that once SpaceX actually does start to trade in the secondary market tomorrow, we could see that entire ecosystem, that entire flywheel of a lot of these space companies start to rally as well.
Well, and when we consider that trading and the entrant of a stock this size, Romaine, how confident should we be that all of the mechanics, the plumbing, is going to work?
It depends on who you ask. There are a lot of concerns right now. Remember, the largest IPO that we've had in the U.S. on a U.S. exchange was Facebook, now Meta, back in 2012, and that did not go well. They had a lot of troubles matching orders, matching prices. At some point, they had to basically shut things down and sort things out. This is an IPO that is multiples the size of that, but we've heard on Bloomberg Television from the heads of NASDAQ, from the heads of the NYSE, from the DTCC, which is one of the main clearinghouses, that they are much more prepared from that. Remember, the technology underpinning our markets is a lot different today than what it was back in 2012. But it remains to be seen, and it'll be interesting as all eyes will be on that tomorrow, one way or the other. Love it, hate it. Kaylee, it is going to be the talk of the town, from Wall Street to Main Street and probably at the White House as well.
Yep, and right there on that set, we know you'll have it covered on the close for us. Bloomberg's Romaine Bostick, thank you so much. And as Romaine touched on, we are expecting to see this record-setting IPO trading begin after pricing, as expected, at $135 a share, raising $75 billion and giving SpaceX a market value of roughly $1.8 trillion. The demand is so great that it was more than 4 times oversubscribed, with retail traders placing more than $100 billion in orders for the stock, according to sources familiar. For more, we turn to Bloomberg's Ed Ludlow, co-anchor of Bloomberg Tech, who's also live from World Headquarters in New York. So, Ed, obviously this pricing was a bit unique in that we knew what the price was going to be. 135 is the number. I guess the question is, how does that number move when trading begins tomorrow?
Yeah, it is the question. And, you know, there is an expectation that it will certainly go to another level higher, but equally within the few hours remaining in Friday's trade, it could come back down. Somebody in the next 12 to 16 hours is going to be disappointed on the allocations, right? So you nailed it on the numbers on the oversubscription, which applies on the institutional side as well as the retail side. And we put a lot of reporting to the idea that some of these kind of storied legacy Wall Street institutions placed very large orders, right? $10 billion a piece in some case, BlackRock at least $5 billion. But they won't all get that allocation. And so there will be a dynamic of the open market Friday, particularly on the retail trade, which is so interesting. This will be, even if it's low 20% is kind of is out there in the reports right now, or it goes up to nearer 30%, it is unprecedented. And so people will want to say, can I get a piece of this? And that action in the moment will be interesting. But this has been an atypical process to get to this point, with Elon Musk firmly in control of it. Well, certainly unique for sure, including the valuation that it is able to get and on what basis that valuation was attained by. Elizabeth Warren, the progressive senator we talk with frequently here in Washington from Massachusetts, had asked the SEC to delay this IPO. She cited concerns about the way it could affect retirement accounts, for example, but also the idea, and I'm quoting her directly from the letter she sent to the SEC, the value of SpaceX shares now and in the foreseeable future appears to be based on a uniquely speculative series of events. But I guess that's
kind of the whole pitch from Elon Musk, right?
Well, when a company files confidentially for an IPO, it does go automatically in that moment to the SEC for a review. And over a period of time, the SEC corresponds with the company that filed confidentially and gives them feedback. And when the S1 flips public, it represents a period of time where the SEC has looked at their proposal with a magnifying glass, and the company typically has responded to those proposals in order to make sure that the prospectus conforms to the rules that the SEC has in place. I'm not answering your question about Elizabeth Warren. I'm just explaining the basics of how a confidential filing works in American public markets and law. But other than that, yes, every prospectus has a story it wants to tell. And in SpaceX's case, there is a TAM, a total addressable market number, that is $28.5 trillion. And it lacks any current period financial information. So the risks are also spelled out in the prospectus in somewhat boilerplate language. The market's had quite a lot of time to digest that.
Yeah, well, and when we consider that total addressable market, obviously it's talking about the market for artificial intelligence and compute power. How should we consider that then, as SpaceX being perhaps a test run of other AI companies looking to go public in the not so distant future, like OpenAI and Anthropic?
Yeah, a lot of people tell me that are already on the cap table, SpaceX is an asset one of one. It is completely different to OpenAI and Anthropic because it's so hardware concentrated. However, they're all going after an enterprise AI market, and there is some advantage in going first. And you will bet that the execs at Anthropic and OpenAI read SpaceX's S1 very closely before they decided to pull the trigger themselves.
All right, Bloomberg's Ed Ludlow, thank you so much, and looking forward to your coverage of this all day tomorrow as trading gets going. We appreciate it. And coming up, key government spy powers are on the verge of lapsing. We'll get a report from Capitol Hill and reaction from Democratic Congressman Glenn Ivey of Maryland. Up next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and Radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and Radio. I'm Kaylee Lyons. Key government spy powers, Section 702 of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, are set to expire at midnight tomorrow, and the House has left town without renewing them, failing today to pass a short-term extension of the program, with a procedural effort to do the same in the Senate also failing shortly after. And of course, it's due to lawmaker pushback against Bill Pulte being tapped by President Trump to be acting director of national intelligence. Trump announced a permanent pick for that role this afternoon in former SEC chair Jay Clayton. But is it too late, especially if Pulte is still going to be serving in an acting capacity in the interim? For more, we turn now to Bloomberg's Erik Wasson, who is live from Capitol Hill. So, Erik, we have the Clayton nomination. According to the Senate Intelligence Committee, a nomination hearing is going to be held next Wednesday, June 17th. But is any of it going to happen quickly enough for FISA not to go dark for the first time?
You know, it looks like it's on track to go dark at the end of Friday. We talked to Chuck Schumer, the Senate Minority Leader, as he was leaving the Capitol for the weekend. He says as long as Bill Pulte is still on track to become the acting top U.S. spy next Friday, it doesn't matter if Trump has chosen Jay Clayton as the permanent pick and if he gets, confirmed eventually. He said as long as the Pulte is still on track, Democrats will be blocking any extension of FISA. I talked to Chuck Grassley, the Judiciary Chairman, shortly thereafter. He said this is blowing a huge hole. Yeah, he wishes he could tell us what's happening in classified briefings, but there'll be a huge hole in national intelligence and risking a terrorist attack. So here we are looking to fly blind starting Friday evening due to this impasse in Congress over Bill Pulte.
Well, how much of that hole, Erik, can be filled via executive order coming directly from President Trump?
You know, we're on the lookout for that. Certainly there's some quarters that feel like that could be something that Trump would try. However, I talked to Hakeem Jeffries before he left town about that, and he told me there's no evidence that Trump could do this without statute, without Congress acting, and it would be challenged in court. The main issue here is companies are compelled under FISA to hand over data of foreign communications, and the companies could just stop complying or challenge in court if it's under executive order rather than by Congress. So it's the compliance issue and the lack of compliance that could create this hole in the data that could lead to an intelligence failure or a terrorist attack.
And finally, Erik, do you expect that Jay Clayton will have any trouble getting confirmed to this role? Obviously, a former SEC chair and a lawyer, not necessarily someone you would think has the deep national security-oriented background.
You know, he's getting a lot of praise. Jim Himes, the top intelligence committee Democrat, saying he's known him for years, respects him. Mark Warner, the top Senate Democrat, also saying he likes Jay Clayton. Thune saying he should go quickly. And all of them basically indicate if this had been the initial plan, if Bill Pulte's name had never been entered the mix, none of this FISA problem with a short-term extension would have really come up. Now, there's still a longer FISA issue. You know, there is an issue when U.S. citizens' data gets caught up in this net. Should there be a warrant to go into that? There's been a push by members of both parties for that long-term fix, but at least a short-term patch could have been done as that longer thing has hashed out. So, you know, I think Clayton will be confirmed pretty quickly, but the lapse will occur nonetheless.
All right, Bloomberg's Erik Wasson, live from Capitol Hill this evening. Thank you so much. And joining me now for more here in our Washington, D.C. bureau is Democratic Congressman Glenn Ivey of Maryland, a member of the House Appropriations and Ethics Committees. Congressman, welcome back to Bloomberg TV and Radio. It's good to see you. Obviously, this Jay Clayton nomination has come a little bit late if it was intended to help make sure FISA is indeed extended. Is it a mistake for the House to be out for the next week? Would you come back into session if called to vote to extend FISA now that this information is in hand?
I'd like to find out more about Clayton, to tell you the truth. I think it's good, as you heard in the previous report, good comments from Mark Warner and Jim Himes. That's reassuring to me. But, you know, I'd like to know more about him than that. It doesn't sound like he's got much of a national security or intelligence background, at least that I've heard so far, and we're all kind of scrambling to get the information, but I haven't heard that yet. And the other part, too, is really there are larger problems before this issue came on, you know, before the personnel issue came on board. We're having big fights about this already, and I don't know that those underlying issues have been resolved yet. So,
you mean issues like warrants?
Oh, yeah.
And
yeah,
potential
exactly.
abuses?
Exactly.
Well, so understanding that those issues are there and there are personnel challenges and opinions when it comes to Bill Pulte, talk me through the risk calculus you and your colleagues had to make on the floor of allowing government spy powers to collapse while we're still actively in conflict with Iran, even if there apparently is a deal in the works, if the president is to be believed. When the World Cup has just kicked off today, what kind of threats could now become much more real in the absence of this warrantless surveillance authority? Well,
two things. One is that, as I understand it, there's a grandfathered protection that's in place that will allow their efforts to continue to seek this out. But secondly, I don't disagree with that. I mean, I think we waited months. Well, the Republican leadership waited months before they really started trying to deal with this. And it's the 11th hour over and over and over again. And so this short extension that they keep putting in place, I think this time people were like, just no, let's actually sit down and get this done. And as far as I know, the speaker left town. So it's absolutely, we're at war. These are dangerous times. And even before we went to war with Iran, these were dangerous times. And you'd want to have better leadership, I think, in place than we had with Tulsi Gabbard. But they haven't been really focusing on this in the way that they should. And the House, speakers had trouble getting anything done on the House floor, frankly, over and over. I think we've gotten more discharge petition legislation through the House than he's gotten legislation that's gone through normal channels that he's shepherded.
Well, and most recently in the case of Ukraine aid. But on the subject of the war, which you just mentioned, it seems, if President Trump is to believe, that we are on the cusp of an agreement being signed to end it. He said some parts of it are still conceptual, but he suggested it could be Saturday or Monday that the Strait of Hormuz is opened back up, and you're already shaking your head at me. You don't buy it.
I mean, I don't know, but this is Groundhog Day. I mean, every day he says, there's negotiations, we're close to a deal. I mean, we're over 100 days into this now, and he's been saying that for 90 plus of those. I'm kind of at the believe it when I see it kind of point at this, right now. And the overall reason for the skepticism, too, is he's really painted us into a corner. The Strait of Hormuz issue, we didn't have a problem there before he started the war in joint conduct with Israel. Now we do, and I don't know what the clear path forward is on that. And the nuclear piece, they said they'd obliterated everything back in June when they did the missile strike then. But now they're saying that there's nuclear material still. We don't know where it is, apparently, and can't find it. So the military option to move forward with that doesn't seem to be in place. And I haven't heard a clear explanation as to what he's got in mind. I'd be happy at this point if we could just get back to where we were with the Obama treaty.
With the JCPOA?
Yeah.
Well, I guess we'll have to see what form this deal ultimately takes. We're still a little light on the details. As we consider, though, and you mentioned that we've been 100 days into this war, we've been expending resources all the while, including really drawing down on munition stockpiles. As a member of the Appropriations Committee, what are you braced for in terms of the resources that may need to be reallocated to the Pentagon with replenishment specifically in mind, as the president is suggesting a Reconciliation 3.0 package in part to go to the Pentagon? I
mean, they're spending money like drunken sailors over there. So, the $4 trillion cut for the tax cut that he wanted to put in place. Now we've got the big dollars that were appropriated for ICE and the Border Patrol. I think that's like $580 billion or somewhere in that range. Now they're talking about a third reconciliation package. And the $1.5 trillion for the Pentagon. It's kind of ridiculous, and they haven't even really explained how they would spend all of this money. That's number one. Number two, the guns and butter issue. Yesterday, we're in appropriations hearing. The Republicans are cutting student loans. They're cutting Job Corps. They're cutting, basic program work study. Things like that to help young people just get their education and become part of the workforce. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. But they're making all these cuts that are hurting regular people and not helping out. And then you layer on top of that the impact of the tariffs, especially from the standpoint of the inflationary impact, along with the war pushing up gas prices. He's doing horrible things for the economy. At the same time, he's overtaxing, I think, at this point, with overusing the appropriations for either the military piece or the internal immigration piece. And so instead of using the money for things that I think could help the economy grow, he's using it for that.
So it sounds like you would be reluctant to vote for a supplemental funding package even that would replenish American stocks.
That's an understatement. I think he's going to need to move money around that he's already got.
Well, and when we consider the wider appropriations process, knowing that the end of the fiscal year, 3.5 months away, it's not so distant in the future. Is there any way that it actually results in a regular order appropriations process, or are you betting we're going to see a continuing resolution until the end of this Congress?
Hard to say. I mean, last year the House passed, I think, 11.5, essentially. We got hung up on the Homeland Security piece. So almost all of them do. And then now I think we're moving pretty quickly. I think we have 1 or 2 left, but we did 2 this week, 2 major bills, labor, HHS, and education and the like. So I think we're moving along at a good clip. Senate's another question. But the larger piece, though, is what's actually being done with the money. The Republicans are not negotiating us with most of these numbers, the top line numbers in particular. So most of these bills are passing without Democratic support. And I think that's a problem along the lines of what we were just discussing.
All right, Congressman, good to have you
Thanks
back in studio with us. Appreciate you joining Democratic Congressman Glenn Ivey of Maryland. And we'll have more on the breaking news of today coming up. This supposed agreement that President Trump is touting with Iran. We'll bring you a panel of experts to assess the diplomatic agreement here and whether or not we can really call it an agreement, as we still have yet to hear from Iran on this. Former Ambassador David Hale and former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for the Middle East, Dana Stroul, will be with us on the other side of this break on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
When it comes to nuclear, you said this was just a concept of that agreement. So is this just essentially setting the stage for deeper talks on nuclear?
It's a very strong memorandum of understanding. That is a little conceptual, but it's something that's going to get done. And if it doesn't get done for any reason, which I can't imagine that not happening, they want to sign it as much as I do or more. I would say they want to sign it more, maybe a lot more. But it's a very detailed memorandum of understanding.
Welcome back to Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. I'm Kaylee Lyons. And that was President Trump in the Oval Office this afternoon, describing what he says is a deal with Iran. The president also saying it's his understanding that Iran's supreme leader is on board and the Strait of Hormuz will be reopened when this deal is signed, potentially as soon as this weekend. Joining us now to unpack it all are David Hale, former ambassador to Pakistan and Lebanon, now a distinguished fellow at the Wilson Center, and Dana Stroul, former deputy assistant secretary of defense for the Middle East and now senior fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. Welcome to you both. Ambassador, I'll start with you as we hear the president saying that parts of this are a little bit conceptual. If that is the case, maybe there's a memorandum, but is there really an understanding?
Well, this is kind of a conventional way to proceed with an agreement between two adversaries who are trying to resolve their differences. We often call it an MOU or a statement of intent or principles. The main point is it's very important that we get onto that piece of paper what our agenda is, what our goals are, and that obviously has been a point of difference. But this is just the beginning. If and when this thing is signed, then you'll enter into a long and undoubtedly protracted negotiation over an actual agreement that would reflect the intent of this MOU. But if it is successful, it is a hurdle that we will have crossed.
Well, and that's a few ifs that I just counted there in the ambassador's answer. Dana, do you think we really are on the cusp here? Because the president has suggested that was the case before.
I think it's clear that both sides want an agreement that ends the fighting more than they want to return to war and end up in an escalatory cycle. The big problem here is that we spent more days in this ceasefire circling the drain on an agreement to have more negotiations than we actually had fighting this war in the first place. And an agreement that basically just has parameters. Maybe it opens the Strait of Hormuz and the U.S. ends its naval blockade to an open for open, but it's kicking down the road all of the really big issues, which President Trump said are the reason we went to war in the first place. The nuclear program, the ballistic missile program, the drones, the support for terrorism. All of those are the big issues that are not going to be addressed or have any agreements at the beginning of this MOU.
Well, so I wonder if you also expect that to be the case, or you would expect for President Trump to actually sign on to a deal, that he would need something pretty solid in terms of commitments on the nuclear program at the onset. Right,
because, I mean, what we read leaking out of the administration or other sources is that there is at least talk about unfreezing assets of the Iranians, which I think the president would have a very difficult time defending if it doesn't also include pretty strong commitment that a negotiation on Iran's nuclear program is really on the table. And I hope that it's really contingent upon a verified outcome on that score.
So you think it would be a mistake to release frozen assets in the absence of a commitment on nuclear?
That's right. I mean, maybe a token amount, but the Iranians will just use that to restock their weapons, to refund their proxies. I personally don't think they really want an agreement. I think they want to draw the things out and hopefully see that the United States loses interest, as too often we have in the past.
Well, so I wonder then if it was important, Dana, that the U.S., through strikes, if not today, yesterday and the day prior in the aftermath of an Apache helicopter being downed by Iran, were important to show that the United States isn't bluffing about its willingness to return to the forceful option.
I do think it's incredibly important that we responded to the downing of U.S. military helicopter by responding. I think our friends and our enemies need to know that if U.S. military personnel are attacked or damaged or our capabilities, that we're going to respond, and we're going to respond strongly. And generally in negotiations, in order to set the conditions for diplomacy to proceed, there needs to be credible military options on the table, and the person or the party you're negotiating with needs to know that you're willing to use military force if diplomacy fails. And this has been part of the tangle of U.S. policy and negotiations with Iran for decades in multiple administrations now. So I think it was really important that the Trump administration laid down this marker and did respond with force and threatened to use more force.
Well, do you imagine, Dana, that if we are at least having some kicking of the can down the road in these negotiations, that they're going to happen over a more prolonged period of time after the memorandum of understanding is signed? Is the U.S. going to have to maintain at least a significant portion of its current force position in the Middle East? Do troops need to stay there to show that the U.S. is able to act at a moment's notice if Iran decides to break parts of this agreement or not move forward in the diplomatic process?
Yes, the Trump administration and U.S. Central Command are going to need to determine what a sufficient level of military force is that can remain in the region so that if these negotiations from the signing of this MOU over those 60 days reportedly, where they'll hammer out the technical details on the big issues like the nuclear program, the Iranian party needs to know that President Trump is serious and remains postured to return to military strikes if diplomacy fails. So whether that's one aircraft carrier, two aircraft carriers, multiple fighter squadrons, and then all of the supporting infrastructure, there's going to have to be a sufficient level of force. It also means we're going to need allies and partners who will help host those forces in order to retain that credible military option.
Well, and there's the consideration of one ally in particular, which is Israel. The Prime Minister's office said that Benjamin Netanyahu spoke to Trump. They are not a party to this memorandum of understanding, but he appreciates Trump pursuing the aim of a non-nuclear Iran. Do you expect that Israel will abide to whatever ultimately is signed here?
I think that Prime Minister Netanyahu is not going to want to get crosswise with the President of the United States. And certainly we don't want Iran to exploit the perception of a difference between our two countries. So that's very important. On the other hand, Hezbollah is going to try to take advantage of any lessening of the temperature, lowering of the temperature. And so I suspect that they will, and Iran will want to try to fill the vacuum and come back and influence the situation in Lebanon. And the way they do that is through violence and intimidation. So Israel still has the potential to act in self-defense, which its own ceasefire with Lebanon allows it to do. Obviously, the art is in defining self-defense and not overdoing it and creating a problem for President Trump.
Well, so how do you consider the Israel factor, Dana? As the ambassador says, they do feel that they face an existential threat from the north. So what are they going to be satiated by here?
Well, we saw a really important demonstration of the tension between Israel's need to defend itself against Hezbollah's attacks from the north and the U.S.-Iran negotiations. So about 10 days ago, there were negotiations between the sovereign government of Lebanon and Israel under the auspices of the United States, and those two agreed to a ceasefire. And it's Hezbollah, the Iran-backed terrorist group, that's violating that. So when Israel responded a few days ago to Hezbollah strikes, Iran responded by seeking to punish Israel and sending ballistic missiles at Israel. And reportedly, President Trump actually asked Israel to dial back its response. And this for Israel in a post-October 7th environment where it's being asked not to respond when its enemies that wanted to disappear off the face of the map, when the United States is asking it not to respond in a forceful way. And so I imagine that in these 60 days, we're going to be seeing testing of the premise that Israel, Lebanon, and Hezbollah are separate from the U.S.-Iran negotiations. The Iranians are going to try to link those together, drive a wedge between the United States and Israel, and it's going to be a real test of the Trump administration and the Netanyahu government to make sure they stay aligned during these negotiations.
So Iran wants these things linked together. It was just a few weeks ago that the president suggested he wanted a deal with Iran linked, Ambassador, to an expansion of the Abraham Accords. I have heard no mention of that today. Is that an effort abandoned, an effort postponed? Do you expect that to really be a factor here?
Well, I think it's a complicated scenario here because obviously the Middle East, objectively, everything's linked. And frankly, it is how the power equation between America and Iran lands at the end of this chapter that will determine really what happens in Lebanon and Israel. That said, so we have to keep the pressure on Iran, obviously, if we want success in Lebanon. That said, it is finally the moment where a sovereign state of Lebanon, as Dana said, is standing up on its own interests. And they want to work with Israel and America against Iran and Hezbollah. So the last thing we should want is to allow Iran to come back into the negotiating venue because they want to take it over and dictate on their interests, not on Lebanese interests.
Well, and when we're saying Iran and they, Dana, I still do have questions about who exactly it is we're referring to. The president in his Truth Social post, when he suggested or said he was calling off the strikes planned against Iran for today, said that discussions have been approved at the highest level of Iranian leadership. He later said in the Oval Office it was his understanding that the supreme leader was on board. Is that enough? Or do you also need to make sure that the IRGC is on board, that the political leadership is on board? Which parties do we need to guarantee are going to stand by this deal?
I think this is one of the central challenges of negotiating with the new Iranian regime right now, which is that the top military and civilian leaders who have ruled Iran for decades and have been around and around in cycles of negotiations with the United States were all basically eliminated in day one of this war, starting on February 28th. We now have a new generation of leaders, many of whom lost family members in those initial strikes, deeply traumatized. And these are people who haven't gone through these rounds of negotiations. You have some holdovers like the Iranian foreign minister, but new deciders like the supreme leader who still haven't shown his face in public once. And remember, the Trump administration and the president are not directly negotiating with the supreme leader or anyone around him. This is all through mediators. There's Pakistani mediation, Qatari mediation. And so what we have an agreement on, if there's not a clear piece of paper where both sides have signed, I think it's very unclear who's authorized to speak for Iran and whether or not there is consensus. And we have seen elements of the Iranian regime like the IRGC play spoilers before because they think they have more to lose from an agreement with the United States than they have to gain. So these are uncertain days ahead.
Well, and it raises the question of who's going to be doing the signing. The president suggested he'll send the vice president, J.D. Vance, to this. Is that perhaps an indication to you, Ambassador, that Iran would not be sending the Ayatollah?
I doubt very much the Ayatollah will be, visible at this point. No one really knows exactly what his state of health is. But I think Dana's making a valid point here is that the problem is not on the American side. If Trump makes a deal, it's less important who signs it than the fact that he has signed off on it and publicly done so. The search for moderates in Iran, I'm reminded of the Lewis Carroll, poem about the search for the hunt for the snark, the mythical elusive thing that doesn't exist. It's the IRCG that matters. No deal with any Iranian that doesn't have the IRCG on board isn't going to last anyway. So that's the target audience, and their interests are pretty ferocious, frankly. Their approach to diplomacy and security is uncompromising.
All right, we'll leave it on that note. Ambassador David Hale and Dana Stroul, thank you both so much for joining. And still ahead, all eyes are on tomorrow's SpaceX trading debut. But what does it mean for President Trump and the White House? The Debrief with Mario Parker is next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and Radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and Radio. I'm Kaylee Lines. SpaceX is making its market debut this week, a major milestone for founder Elon Musk and a fresh reminder of how closely his business empire is tied to Washington. Musk and President Trump were once partners in the push to shrink the federal government before a very public falling out. But last week, the president indicated the two are back on better terms.
Look, Elon, he had a bad moment, but now he's a friend of mine again. He had a very bad moment. He's 80% brilliant and 20% he's got little bad moments.
Joining us now for more in this week's Debrief is Bloomberg's Mario Parker. 80% brilliant, 20% bad moments. Mario, what do we know about the way in which Elon Musk still does or does not have the ear of the president when they worked so closely together at the onset of his
Yeah, sure. Absolutely, Kaylee. Sources that I speak with inside and close to the White House tell me that they speak regularly now, Elon Musk and President Trump. But the relationship is more of that of a normal CEO presidential type relationship as opposed to kind of the buddy relationship that we saw that marked over the course of 2024 and 2025 as well, right? Where you would have Elon Musk having sleepovers at the White House. You would see little X running around in the Oval Office as well. The sources that I speak with say that those days are largely over. It's a professional relationship. These days, professional CEO relationship that the president may have with any other CEO where they speak regularly along business terms, but not as personal.
Well, of course, he's not just any CEO. He's the world's richest man. He's presided over the world's biggest ever IPO. And there's actually members of the administration who stand to gain financially from this SpaceX listing, right?
Yes. As far as some of the government disclosures that were filed last year, about 10 U.S. officials have had some ties to Elon Musk companies, SpaceX or either AIX. That's Steve Witkoff, that's Kelly Loeffler, that's others as well. Some of those range from $9.3 million or so upwards to $40 million. Now, one caveat, of course, is that those some of those shares could have been sold since then, so we don't have immediate visibility into who holds what shares right now or how much they may have been enriched by this.
Well, we know Musk is going to be enriched by this, as if he needed more money to go around. He was not shy about spending that money politically in 2024. Where is he in this midterm cycle?
Yeah, and that's an important point, Kaylee, because when you look at the evolution of the relationship between Trump and Musk, if you recall going all the way back to 2022, 2023, the presidential primary, Musk backed Ron DeSantis back then. If you recall, there was that ill-fated X rollout that DeSantis had there as well. But when he and President Trump started to have warm ties, he spent upwards of $291 million on the 2024 presidential election. That goes a long way toward that relationship. We haven't seen him be as active, but we expect MAGA Inc. and others to be very active. The president has over $1 billion in his war chest as well for the midterms. We expect Musk to deploy some of his capital also.
All right, Bloomberg's Mario Parker with this week's debrief. Thank you so much. And joining us now for more on this and all of the other news we've been dealing with today is our political panel. Adam Hodge, Managing Director at Bully Pulpit International and Democratic Strategist, alongside Leslie Shedd, founder of Rising Communications, a non-resident fellow at the Atlantic Council and former senior staffer to the House Foreign Affairs Committee. There's a lot of breaking news I could throw at you two. Leslie, I'll begin with the president's announcement this afternoon that he's tapping the former chair of the SEC, Jay Clayton, to be a permanent Director of National Intelligence. But Bill Pulte is still going to serve in the interim, even though it blew up a deal on FISA. What do you make of that?
Well, I think it's interesting. I don't know if you saw, but as I was waiting to come and join you on set here, there was an announcement that there will be a hearing already scheduled. 17th. Yep. So we're looking at next week for that to happen. I wouldn't be surprised if they try to expedite this as quickly as possible, probably to reassure those senators who are not supportive of Mr. Pulte being the acting DNI, to try to expedite this as quickly as possible and get Mr. Clayton in. And so far, it looks like he'll have hopefully a nice, smooth landing. There's already been multiple Democrats that have come out and said that they would support him,
including Senator Warner, the top Democrat on the Intelligence Committee. Adam, so does this solve the issue for your party?
Jay Clayton is a serious person, and this job obviously demands a serious person. I would argue for the first time, Tulsi Gabbard not exactly rising to that level. So we're clearing a very low bar with Jay Clayton. But he's taking over, and he would take over a house that's on fire, the way that the Trump administration has gutted many of the key elements of the intelligence community, and the morale is at an all-time low. And they've been asked to do Herculean tasks on Iran, on Cuba, on Venezuela, all kinds of other issues without a really strong leader at the top. So I don't think that the concerns that we have about the Trump administration's wreckage of the intelligence community goes away with Jay Clayton. He's got a big task in front of him if he's confirmed for the job. And hopefully we can get 702 passed. Hopefully this puts it all to bed.
Well, do you believe, Leslie, that he's going to inherit a much smaller DNI's office by the time Bill Pulte's done, I guess, depending on how long Pulte really is in there?
I would be surprised if he ends up being in there for that long. I think that they are clearly trying to expedite this. They understand that this is an important person. They want to get him in. I wouldn't be surprised if he's in before the end of the month. There has been a long, ongoing discussion, bipartisan discussion, about the need for the DNI. And do we really need this, this national security and national intelligence agency when we have all of these other agencies? I'll be interested to see kind of what comes of this, if there is a way to maybe streamline it and make it more effective. Right now, it kind of just feels like an additional layer of bureaucracy rather than something that is doing what it should be doing, which is serving as kind of an intergovernmental operation.
All right, I want to switch gears, Adam, to the other news of today, which is President Trump suggesting that as soon as this weekend, we could see a deal signed with Iran, reopen the Strait of Hormuz. Conceptually, he says parts of it will address the nuclear program. Do you buy it?
Look, we're about 6.5 scaramucci's into this current ceasefire. I'll be surprised if this threat lasts a full one, right? I don't think we're going to get 10 days before we're back in some other, change to where we're threatening to bomb Iran, because Iran has no incentive really to strike a deal. They have found a way to do great damage to the American economy, the American people, by closing the Strait of Hormuz, and gas prices, fertilizer prices, prices of chips are going up all because of this. And they know that has President Trump desperate to reach a deal. And so I'd be surprised, and you've already seen them push back on this idea that there is some sort of deal in the last 25 minutes or so. And so I think we're going to be in this sort of ongoing football. And the president really, he is Charlie Brown. Iran is holding the football as Lucy. And it seems like once again, he's going to try to go and kick the ball, and they're going to pull it away from him. I just don't think we're going to see a solution anytime soon.
Do you, Leslie?
I think we could. Look, I think people that underestimate President Trump and his ability to get a deal done have been proven wrong time and time again. I agree on the fact that Iran is not trustworthy. They have a long history of taking advantage of these ceasefires and trying to prolong these negotiations. But I disagree that they don't have an incentive here. The president has made it clear he is not afraid to take serious and significant attacks against Iran in order to get them to come to the table. If he did go into Karg Island, even and just bombed it, even if we weren't talking about some type of an invasion, I mean, that could decimate the Iranian economy for a generation. They know that. They don't want that. I think he has taken all the right steps that he needs to take right now to bring Iran to the table, and I hope that this deal works.
Well, I guess it also becomes a question of can the deal... Oh, sorry, Adam, go for it.
No, I was just going to say the only thing that I think is important to remember when this all started and the mixed messages from the beginning. At first, it was we were going to get rid of the nuclear program that apparently was obliterated last summer anyway, but putting that aside, we're not even talking about actually having a deal on the table for this ceasefire, right? There's talk of another talks about a deal on the nuclear program. They clearly still have their missiles. They clearly still have a lot of the other tools to bomb other countries in the Middle East. So I just really we need to take a step back and look at where we actually are with this sort of agreement, where Iran still has many of the same tools they had before, and we're weaker all because of it, and we're paying higher gas at the same time.
We have less than a minute left, but do you believe Israel is going to be okay with whatever is ultimately decided here, whenever it's decided, Leslie?
That is really the question, right? I think that Israel is going to do what's in the best interest of Israel, just as I expect any country to do. I think that they very much question Iran's, willingness to stick to any of these agreements. I think they are very concerned about the way in which they use their terrorist proxies around the world. So we'll see. I think if anybody could get them to agree, it's going to be President Trump.
We're out of time. Adam, thumbs up on Israel, or do you expect Netanyahu could disrupt this?
He disrupted it before. I think that's going to continue.
All right, Adam Hodge and Leslie Shedd, our political panel this evening, thank you so much for joining. And of course, for more coverage, check out the Washington Edition newsletter on the terminal and online. And we'll see you back here tomorrow on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.